Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and committing and dedicating time to your roles as faculty members. This is wonderful. And even more importantly, dedicating your time to improving the education for your learners, which you all are so good at doing. As a reminder, we have a repeat of this session at noon for your colleagues who were unable to attend this morning. We also this evening have our big annual reception, at which point we'll have a little welcome from the dean. We'll also have our annual Teach Awards presented, and all of our posters for folks who have done anything innovative education-wise throughout the year, and also 2 podium presentations from folks who have done really great things over the past year related to education efforts. So this morning, I'm sorry, thank you for pointing that out. So this morning and noon are both in this room. However, the reception is over in the Simulation Center, the new Simulation Center, which is at 15 Old Woods, which is really just behind the Starbucks and Moe's. So if you go behind and then you go over to the left over the train tracks, you'll see it's the old trolley barn, the brick building with the glass on the front. So I hope to see you all there. It will be a wonderful event. Food and beverages, not the real beverages, but sodas and water, things like that.
Something liquid.
Something different here. Okay, so welcome this morning, and I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Dr. Gruppen, Dr. Larry Gruppen here today. Dr. Gruppen is professor in the Department of Learning Health Sciences at the University of Michigan Medical School, where he directs the competency-based Master's in Health Professions Education program. His research interests center around the development of expertise, knowledge, and performance assessment, self-regulated learning, and educational leadership development. He has held the office of President of the Society of Directors of Research in Medical Education and Chair of the AAMC Central Group on Educational Affairs. He was also the founding chair of the AAMC's Medical Education Research Certificate Program. So that's MERC, also part of our HERS program. Dr. Gruppen has over 135 peer-reviewed publications on a variety of topics in medical education and has been recognized for career productivity by the AAMC CGEA Medical Education Laureate Award, the 2015 John P. Hubbard Award from the National Board of Medical Examiners, and the Merrill Clare Award from the AAMC Group on Educational Affairs. Quite big accomplishments. Dr. Gruppen earned his bachelor's in psychology from Calvin College and both his master's and his PhD in psychology from the University of Michigan. We are so grateful to have him with us today to engage us in thoughtful conversation regarding the Master Adaptive Learner. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Larry Gruppen.
So it's a real pleasure for me to be here. I spent the summer on the Blue Ridge Parkway working at a gas station back in the 70s, so coming back to Virginia was always a treat. Although I am getting a little bit paranoid because I was in Richmond during Hurricane Florence, and I was in Atlanta during Hurricane Michael, and now I'm here during LCME. So disaster either follows me or precedes me. So I hope that's not going to be the case, at least in this presentation. So what I'd like to do today is to describe for you this larger, in the context of education and educational principles, which, of course, with the LCME you're thinking about a lot. This framework, which we are calling the Master Adaptive Learner, which combines a variety of things. It's almost like a big code book with pegs that you can hang on many of the issues that we wrestle with in teaching, and particularly in learning, and thinking about the learning process for our students. I want to highlight the fact that although I'm making the presentation, the model itself really comes from a very large collaboration that the American Medical Association has funded, the Accelerating Change in Education Initiative, where 11 schools have been sharing about $10 million to try to develop innovations to promote education And this model, the Master Adaptive Learner, is one of the products of that. So it is a child with many parents, scholars, educators, clinicians who are contributing to our understanding, to our thinking about learning in the context of medical education. So it really centers around what, and again, the LCME is a great context for this. What is the purpose of a medical school, of medical education? Well, part of it is that we want to develop people who are experts in their field. We want expert pathologists, we want expert internists, we want people who can be skilled practitioners. We also want people who are just thoughtful, good thinkers, regardless of their discipline, but we want people who are broad, who can think critically about things in which they are experts, but also in things in which they may not be. But they have to make decisions even when they're not experts. But really, in the long run, and I'm sure this is in your document as well, what we're doing in a medical school, we're trying to develop lifelong learners. We want people who will learn here, but we also want them to learn when they leave. And the ongoing learning that takes place in practice is really what makes the difference. We can teach them a lot of things in medical school, but we know it's out of date as soon as they leave. So they have to continue to learn. And it's this last one, the ongoing learning, that is so challenging because it is all up to you. It's up to the individual. There's no curriculum. There's no faculty member holding you to account. There's more, but not much assessment to give you guidance. So it really is a focus to try to develop lifelong learners, people who can self-direct their own learning and pursue that process on their own. So this is what has given rise to this idea of a master adaptive learning. That we want more than just learning for now, which is just retrieving what you've been told, and more than just next year's application, but we really want to focus on the learning that takes place over the next couple of decades. So there are, I don't know if there are handouts here or if you had to print them out, but I've given you a handout, kind of a program to keep track of all the characters that are coming in and out of this drama to illustrate this framework that we're calling the Master Adaptive Learner. In this case, I want to point you to the lower left-hand corner, which is the identification of the main movers in this, which is Bill Couture and Don Moore, who really were the spark plugs for developing this project. But to highlight again that it is a fairly recent development by a lot of people. It's published in Academic Medicine last year, so this diagram is used with their permission. Let me give you an orientation to the different parts that we'll spend some time on as we go through this. Okay, so at the top we have the fact that even though we're talking about the individual learner, learning always takes place in a community. So we're representing that by having multiple people here, but we're really focusing on the learning that is in one person's mind. So it's in a social context, but we're really focused on the individual learning in this case. And this environment is a critical part of it because the learning is taking place usually in the context of work. So the problems that you're dealing with, what you're learning, is often driven by what you're working on. So the environment is a major component of that. But the crux of it is these four interlocking gears, because these are the four components of the self-regulated, self-directed learning process. And each of these goes in a cycle through the learning process. And each one has specific characteristics and requirements that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. But overall, the idea is that there is a cycle of learning that takes place in the context of a, of a workplace environment with other people engaged in the process and providing a context for that. So I want to start with the broader psychological phenomena that are taking place as a context, as a psychological context for this learning process. And we have four of these elements, thank you, four of these phenomena that are really important for understanding this larger process of learning. The first is self-monitoring. Effective, self-directed, self-regulated learning requires that you are really, in a sense, monitoring yourself. You're paying attention to what you're doing, what you're thinking, self-examining why you came up with that decision, critically appraising your own decisions, your own judgment, trying to get feedback on what you've done and whether it turns out to be correct. So this self-monitoring is kind of like the second one, a metacognitive. You're thinking about your own thinking. And this is something that we typically don't do. As experts, part of what makes us skilled and valuable and special is that we can do a lot of things without thinking. So a lot of our expertise is automatic, it's unconscious, we just do it, we know it, we don't have to think about it. So this metacognition, this self-monitoring is really a challenge for a lot of experts to take that step back and think about what you're doing, because usually your thinking is very automatic. So reflection of understanding and appreciating what you've done and why you've done it, and the critical thinking are all four very closely related constructs that really are essential as an overall underpinning for this process. If you don't think about your thinking, you're not going to really be an effective learner outside of a formal educational context. So it's also important to recognize that in formal education, this gets short-circuited because we've got faculty and we've got exams and we've got lots of other things telling you what you're supposed to learn and how you're supposed to think. And the concern is that if this is our goal, does medical school suppress it? Does it prevent or cause all of these kinds of activities to atrophy? In addition to this larger context, we've got some individual characteristics that we've identified as being important. So like the metacognitive context for this is a series of individual characteristics that, again, are not limited to this learning process, but it's part of the psychological context for making it work. And these are things like curiosity. If you have high levels of curiosity, it's going to facilitate the learning, self-regulated learning process. Same with motivation. You're motivated by a variety of things. Some of them are very adaptive for trying to be competent, trying to demonstrate expertise, solving problems. Other motivation is not adaptive, grubbing for grades, trying to do things because you're told to do them, but without understanding a purpose for it. Mindset. Mindset refers to some psychological research that has identified that people can approach learning with two different mindsets. One is they think about knowledge and your ability to learn as being a fixed quantity, that you're either smart or you're not. And if you're smart, you can learn a lot. If you're not, you can't. But it's fixed. It's defined for you. And you're kind of a victim of fate. The other mindset is a more an adaptive, a growth mindset, where the understanding, your perspective on what you're doing is that you can always continue to learn. That there's always capacity to learn more, to continue this process. And the research suggests that people who have this attitude about learning, that it is something I can continue to grow in, tend to engage in self-regulated learning to a much higher degree and are more effective at it. So the mindset, the way you're thinking about learning itself makes a difference, as does resilience. Resilience is a kind of a hot topic, a fad. Lots of issues about trying to promote resilience in students and residents and faculty to combat burnout and stress. But it's also one of these things that we think feeds into the learning process as well. People with high levels of resilience can deal with uncertainty and setbacks and being wrong more effectively than people who are more fragile. So these batteries are characteristics of the individual that we think fits into this model. But there's also the opportunity for teaching to make a difference. So this is all about the learner, but the teacher is still an important aspect of this, where the idea of coaching as someone who can both nurture this process but also provide feedback about performance and guidance in the form of coaching provides an opportunity even for you who are very, well into the independent, self-directed learning phase of your career, can still get advice, still get feedback, still benefit from interacting with colleagues. So those are kind of contextual factors. So now we'll go into the core of the learning process, the self-regulated learning process. And it has these 4 phases that are all interlocking so that moving one moves the others. And within them, there are various characteristics, various components that I'd like to describe in a little bit of detail. But I want you to think about them in the context of the environment here, the learning environment here, and the extent to which things are supportive or obstacles to this kind of learning. Because that's what we've been doing. For Michigan, LCME is a year and a half away, 2 years. So we're starting to think about this, and we're starting to wrestle with how do we deal with the fact that we want learners to continue to learn, not become dependent on what they're told they have to do. Is our environment really supporting that? So this is one of the uses we're making of this framework as a way to guide our thinking. So the first one starts with the planning phase, the way it's described here. It really centers on the critical phase of recognizing that there's a gap, that you personally have a gap in knowledge or in performance or understanding, something that should be different than the way it is now. That gap is what we say guides the opportunity for learning. So recognizing that there's an opportunity for improvement is necessary to start the learning process. And in part of that process is identifying the gap and what might give you information to address that gap. So let's look at that one in a little bit more detail. We think that in this larger planning process, we've got 4 components. Questioning. This goes back to the larger context of curiosity. So asking lots of questions, always having that mindset of curiosity, of asking, what don't I understand? What can I learn in this process? Fits into this aspect of the learning process. Searching for information in the environment, just trying to find out what's happening, what's going on, and then setting goals for learning. That you have a target that guides this whole process. This change magnitude is one of the intriguing parts, that part of what you do when you identify a gap that you need to fill is to come to some determination of whether this is manageable. Is this a small enough goal, small enough gap that I can accomplish? Or is it going to require a change in the whole system? So your initial judgment about whether this is manageable becomes part of this phase. Often not very explicit, but I think it is psychologically something that enters into the decision-making process. So talk a little bit more about the details of this one. Gap recognition, I think personally, is the most challenging part of this whole process. Because so much of what we do as routines. Patients come in, we're seeing them for many of the same problems. It's another person with diabetes, and we've seen this over and over again. So that it's not very often that we even recognize that there's a gap, that there's something we can learn from this. And usually that it comes when your routine expertise fails. So the way you've always been doing things doesn't work anymore. There's a patient who doesn't respond. There's a problem that pops up out of nowhere, apparently. And the learning process starts with those problems. So it's when you recognize that something's not working, that you slow down, you stop the automatic, unconscious part of your expertise, and you realize that you may be at the borders of what you're really competent at. And if that's the case, then there's an opportunity for learning. Sometimes this comes from other people. Sometimes it comes from your own practice. But unless you identify a gap, you don't do anything. No gap, no learning. So this part, to me, is underappreciated because we don't really know how this happens. Because that moment, a psychological moment when you recognize that there's a gap, is a very brief period of time from when you're confident that you know everything that's going on, and now you recognize that there's something that isn't right. How does that happen? What happens mentally to identify that gap, and what are the conditions under which those emerge? So this is an area that I think we have a lot to learn about, and it's a very difficult area, but one that is absolutely critical to get this process started. If, in a lot of the research on continuing education for practitioners, you can get individuals to identify in a given day half a dozen or more gaps, things that they would like to know about that they don't understand. A lot of it's literature-based, what is the current research, current information. But there are always more things that we don't know that we could spend time on than there is time. So the challenge is, how do we prioritize? How do you decide of all the things that I would like to know, I would like to understand that I have a gap or deficiency or a problem, what do I spend time on? And how do those priorities get set? So what are the incentives around this? Are you doing it for your own benefit? Does it have a direct impact on patient care? Is it going to, will be easy to address? Can I call up a buddy and ask a question and get the answer and I'm done? Or is this going to require an intensive investigation of the literature? So among the gaps that you might identify, you need to prioritize which ones are going to be most effective. And part of this comes, the challenge of identifying a gap and how to fill it is that when we're dealing with our uncertainty, we have this challenge of not knowing what that really means. Is our uncertainty, is our doubt, our questions, is this a reflection of me and my ignorance, or is this a reflection of the field? And a part of this early process of gap identification is trying to figure out where the gap is. So we have the Johari window here, which is widely known as a way to think about how we share uncertainty. And many of the things that we spend most of our time in this area, where we know things and we know that others know them. And this is the shared understanding that we have as expert practitioners. Then we have areas of uncertainty. So this area here, the not known to self. So if you identify a gap, the question is this something that other people know about? And it's just my problem? Or is this also a true unknown that other people don't know about as well? Obviously, trying to address the gap in the upper corner is going to be easier because you've got experts, you've got resources, you've got the answer out there, as contrasted to if nobody knows about it. Now, some of you will recognize this as being Donald Rumsfeld's. We know there's some things that are known that everybody knows, but for him it was the unknown unknowns, the things that nobody knows that are out there to catch us. And these are the ones, this is where we do research. This is where we try to advance our knowledge. So for an individual, the question is, which one is it? It's things that other people know or things that require research. So as I mentioned before, this little gear in the diagram is really where things start, often where things run off the rails right away because we don't take advantage of the opportunities that are there for learning. But let's assume that we identify a gap. We have a deficiency that I need to know more about, or I need to find a way to address this problem. So we've identified a gap, and now the challenge comes, how do we learn about it? What's the process of really addressing that gap? So engaging in learning, notice that it is not a necessary consequence of identifying a gap. Many gaps are never addressed because there's no learning attached to it. And in the learning phase, we really identify two components. There's the critical appraisal, evidence-based medicine. How do we find evidence in a systematic way to address a problem? And then there are a variety of learning strategies that we can use to try to take advantage of the resources that might be out there. People, literature, knowledge of various kinds, all of which might be resources to fill our gaps. So there are a lot of learning strategies, and a lot of, many schools have offices of learning support or various other names that are there to help learners get over some adverse learning strategies that they've acquired through college and in early years of medical school. Some of these are what we see students doing, and maybe we do as well. Rereading, highlighters, you just highlight everything in the book, it must be important, and I've highlighted it, I've learned it. Mass practice, cramming, trying to learn everything I can at this one moment because I'm going to need it tomorrow for an exam. These are all, we've got evidence to demonstrate that all of these are not ineffective completely, but they're less effective than other strategies. So there are some inappropriate, maladaptive learning strategies that students and us can fall into in trying to address these gaps. What we're really looking for is learning that's deeper and more lasting. A couple of things that I can highlight for these. I'll spend here, but there are lots of, this is a whole area of education, of developing effective learning strategies. But part of what we have to factor into this is the assessment. Because assessments in a formal education are usually, they're used more as a dipstick to try to figure out just how much someone knows, rather than a learning opportunity. And good, effective assessment can be a very powerful tool for helping people learn, partly because it identifies what they don't know, and using that to guide their subsequent learning. But we tend not to use it effectively that way, and instead we use it to do this quick measurement, and then we all forget about it. So one of the learning strategies that has been demonstrated to be effective is spacing the learning over time. I'm not sure what your curriculum is, but we've had at Michigan many iterations where it's, especially when it was departmentally based, we would teach everything about pediatrics in 6 weeks. And then you could forget about it. And a lot of students did. They kind of emptied their brain and prepared it to get filled with something else. So massing the practice of learning in a short period of time is less effective than spacing it out. So it's a difference between that kind of rote memorization that tends to happen in the crunch times and distributing it. So this is one illustrative curve of what happens during typical situations where the learning takes place over a period of time, the number of events within this period of time, and the learning is fairly quick. But the problem is that the forgetting is even quicker. Yes?
I didn't know whether it was appropriate to raise hands or not, but I
Absolutely, yeah.
I've been struck, you're using the word learning.
I'm learning, yes.
It seems to me the more important concept is understanding.
Good
Because
distinction.
retention
Yes.
is
Yeah.
so much better if you understand. And we test only the memory of
Factual stuff.
factual, acute memory, which may, not link the items A and B, but the link may provide the real.
You are absolutely right. And I stand corrected or clarified that really we should be talking about understanding in all of this. Learning is necessary, not sufficient.
I think, and I worry about, and I think understanding gaps. I worry today that we have less, and this is a topic others have heard me comment about, our electronic communications doesn't lend itself to identifying gaps as readily as you and I talking. Interchange.
Yeah.
I think that as a learner, we're working with the residents in clinic this week, and there's one sitting over there, I learn my gaps a lot quicker and feel bad about it, and then go understand that gap, and it stays with me.
Yeah, and you're right. I tend to drift into more of a fact-based presentation because we can talk, if you don't know something, factual, I mean, that's an easy gap to identify.
Agree.
Say, I don't know how this works. I need to study up and figure
But
this
if you
out.
understand how it works,
So the understanding is much more complex because with understanding, you may be able to infer just by understanding how everything else, okay, I don't understand how this is working, but I think I know why it should be or what it should be doing. So I think you're absolutely right. Understanding is a richer, I think the model applies to the understanding as well. But I think in many ways it's more complex, much more nuanced.
less emphasized, unfortunately.
I'm sorry?
I think the learning is less emphasized in what we do today.
Yes. I think we tend to use learning for a lot of actual.
Or substitute.
Yeah. Understanding. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's a very important point, and I appreciate that clarification. I think we're kind of fuzzy when we talk about learning. People who develop this were thinking of everything. If there's any kind of acquisition, but a lot of it is, for medical students, it's the kind of factual.
Because if you learn it, well, you're a much better doctor.
Yeah, and if you understand it,
And understand.
so if you're understanding it, a lot of this is not the issue. Because you're not forgetting specific facts.
Because it ties together.
Yeah, good point. Very good, thank you. So in this case, the idea is that if you mass all your learning into a specific period of time and never come back to it again, you're going to lose it, especially if it's factual information. So the idea is that if you space the learning over a longer period of time, it makes the memory more resistant. So learning things over and over again, coming back to it, is by itself a benefit. Just distributing the practice over a longer period of time. Part of it comes because of another learning strategy, which we can talk about as interleaving, where we're not focused on one topic to the exclusion of everything else, but we're intermingling other content. And this looks like a lot of medical school curriculum, where we take a discipline-based curricula that had blocks, and now we're dividing them up into interspersed weeks or different phases or modules or components that are trying to do more integration. So this integration idea as a curricular design fits into this aspect where we are learning the way we learn things is largely artificial reflection of the way that we've organized medical schools, organized scientific knowledge. This isn't reality. Reality comes at us in a mess. Everything's connected to everything. So the idea that we are interweaving is kind of reflecting the way we encounter reality. We encounter problems that are drifting across these disciplinary boundaries. So the argument here is that by learning in this interconnected way, you will see connections, more understanding of how things are related across these factual buckets in ways that will enable you to learn better and remember more. And these two work together because if you're interleaving, you're usually spreading out the time on a given topic or a different outcome. So these kinds of learning strategies can be used to structure formal education. These actually have curricular implications, but they're also important strategies for learners, for all of us, to recognize that there are better and worse ways for learning in connection to a gap that we might have identified. So the learning process is what we spend a lot of time on as faculty, because that's the part that we kind of define the gaps for the learners, and we tell them what they need to learn. We don't really talk as much about how you're going to learn it. I don't know, maybe you do that with residents more, or some of you as experienced effective teachers will recognize that it's more about we need to talk to our learners about how they learn as well as what they learn. And this is trying to emphasize that. So the third gear in this cycle is what happens after you've done the learning. Because learning is incomplete unless you apply it. And this gear is really the kind of the back check, the feedback of putting it into practice and seeing if it works. And this one has two aspects to it that both are related to feedback. So you have the importance of external feedback that you get from the environment, you get from other people, and you have self-assessment, where you are getting feedback from watching yourself. There are the important part, the learning, which may be factual, may be understanding, is really consolidated when you put it into practice. And usually this is in the same context in what that generated the original question. So you have a patient with diabetes not responding to treatment, you identify this as something I need to look into, you do that, consult with the endocrinologist or whatever the case may be, then you go back and try to address the same problem, same patient, see if they respond differently now. So this check on the knowledge, on the learning, is whether it's been successful or not, takes place in this phase. Because self-assessment is part of this process, it's important to identify that this is a very flawed tool. That we rely on self-assessment sometimes almost exclusively, because when we're in practice, we don't get feedback in the form of tests. We don't get feedback in terms of someone like Atul Gawande, who had a colleague watch him do surgery and give him feedback on what he did. Most of the time, we're just saying, oh, that seemed to go pretty well. Or I had a problem there, the patient was not very cooperative. So we tell our own stories to ourselves, and these stories are often not very accurate. There's a lot of evidence out there that we have a late Wobegon problem. How many are below average drivers here? Two honest people. So
We can't all be below average.
this is Virginia, after all. The challenge is when we're assessing ourselves, we have what's our standard of reference? I'm sorry?
That's ourselves.
Well, yeah. And it's usually like this, so how do I feel about myself? And the problem is that that's focusing on this dimension here. Am I conscious of what I can do or what I can't do, or am I unconscious? And I think many of you have probably seen this before, that we have this cycle where we start off incompetent, but we don't know we're incompetent. But we figure, I want to be a doctor. I know I don't know anything about being a doctor. I need to go to medical school. So I make a decision to start addressing my incompetence. And what happens is that the first phase of learning fills in a lot of these gaps, and we're very conscious of it. And often it takes all of our consciousness to fill these. After learning, we move from incompetent to competent. And that's where many medical students and a lot of residents are. They're very conscious of what they know. And then they have to think about it in applying it. But then we get to the unconsciously competent, which includes most of the people in this room, where you've overlearned this. You know what works. You've done this before. You don't need to think about it anymore. The challenge with the self-assessment is that when you become unconsciously competent, you are not thinking very explicitly about what you know, because it's obvious. And we risk of becoming, over time, changes in the healthcare system, of treatment of modalities, lots of reasons. Over time, we move from being competent to incompetent, but we're still unconscious, because it's always worked this way before. So this is just a way to highlight the fact that your self-assessment, your confidence that things are fine, is probably a bad sign. It might well be an indicator that you're up in this area, that you need to start identifying some deficiencies. Yes, ma'am?
This is what happens when I think we got into the whole EMR system, because we had all of these really great providers that once we adopted the EMR, the location that I had just retired or left. And I feel like maybe this was the key, is that they were so consciously competent, and then something changed, and that threw them completely off of their game.
Yeah, I think that, yes, you're raising the issue. I'm focusing this on, so as a psychology, this is the individual. And that's what I'm really focusing on here, is how the individual learns. You're bringing up the fact that this environment, which we'll still get to, really puts some challenges in it, because you're addressing the fact that most of the time our practice is not as an individual. We're practicing within the system. And we develop this competence of which we're unconscious now in one domain, one system, one area. And now we try to transfer it into a different one. So you hired somebody into the system. You've changed the environment in which they were previously competent. Now you're putting them in a different situation, and they're not as competent. But the problem is they may not be aware of that.
Is that good or bad?
I'm sorry?
Is that good or bad? That's the thing, not quite sure.
That's a fact of life.
Yeah.
So it's a fact of life. And I think the argument here is that when those changes happen, that's when your gap detector needs to be activated. That you need to go into it and say, okay, I'm being hired to now do this here. What's different? And these differences aren't things to paper over, but these may be things that I need to adapt to. It's an opportunity for learning. So big changes like that are often easier to deal with, because we recognize that I don't know where to park. I don't know how this place works. I mean, I got a lot of things I need to learn. It's when the changes are incremental and you just tend to drift from that competence in understanding.
I mean, and it's ongoing gap recognition.
That's ongoing, yes.
If we don't have gap recognition all the time, we're in trouble.
Right. But then it goes back to the slide about priorities, because there are infinite number of gaps.
Of course.
You can go really small or really big. So you have to decide which ones matter. But yeah, you're absolutely right, that without the gap, this is very comfortable. This is the routine. This is what we really strive for. And then a lot of systems too. If you can weed out all of the errors like a Six Sigma and get down to a refined process that will work the same way every time, is great until the environment changes. And it doesn't work as it used to.
The choice of the categories, the competent versus incompetent, implies a static state.
Yes.
Okay? And if the categories were not improving, then you've got a continuous loop going on more readily than implying. Because people's self-esteem ties into the I'm competent. And so there's this huge resistance to recognize that in some areas, no, I'm not competent.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
That's why
There is a deficiency of that today.
Yeah. Oh, I can satisfy incompetence for several people.
Which might be this next one here, external assessment. So yeah, we can provide external assessments about other people's competence without much difficulty. What the literature indicates is that we can still use self-assessment as long as it's tied to some external feedback. So some mechanism by which you can check yourself against some external standard, a colleague, hospital metrics, outcomes, data, anything that we can find that can help us refocus and recalibrate our self-assessment is really, really important. So yeah, if you can get someone who will accept your judgment about their competence, then it becomes coaching. And that's great. I mean, there's lots of evidence that coaching is really powerful, especially for people who are out of informal educational setting. So getting that external information, that feedback, is critical, but it's also very expensive. We build medical schools to provide this on a routine basis, but students paying a lot of tuition for that privilege. So we need to find ways to change our environment to support that. So coming around to this last part of the cycle where we've identified the gap, we've tried to fill the gap, we've checked on the gap by putting it into practice. Then we have to decide whether this learning is, or understanding, let's put it that way, whether this understanding is sufficient to change my practice. So right up until now, everything has been it's all this kind of cognitive thing. But now you're going to change your habits. So you're going from this, the routine, or from the adaptive part into a routine. And in this one, this year, we have two aspects. One is deciding whether this requires a change in my behavior because it's a routine part of my day. I do this all the time, so it's really important then to actually translate it into change in my behavior, or is this a change for me or a change for the system? Because those are clearly different scales of trying to change. But unless this phase happens, there's no lasting change in behavior. You may have read about something and thought, this is kind of intriguing. I remember reading something about the flipped classroom, but if you've never done it and you don't do it on a routine basis, you don't have the understanding that you need. So this is really the adoption of innovation. And those of you who are familiar with that framework know that this adoption takes place in stages. So the first time you learn about something and try to put it into practice, you're still early in those phases of going from knowledge to knowing that it exists, to persuasion, knowing that it, or having the motivation, being convinced that this is a good thing, to a decision to actually do it, putting it into practice, and then the confirmation that it works, that this is worth pursuing. It's been demonstrated over and over again, with Rogers being the name most commonly associated with this, but it's based on data that go well back into the 30s when they were looking at farmers adopting new hybrids of corn. And they would identify the fact that this was a fairly common curve, that you have at the introduction, not many people are planting this hybrid. And that stays pretty flat for quite a while, almost 6 years before people really started to adopt it. And then you have a fairly steep rate of adoption for several years, and then it levels off. And you've heard about the early adopters who will try anything new, maybe because it's new, but these are the ones that will be at this part of the curve. And then you have the late adopters, ones who will not change unless there's no alternative. And you have probably a good chunk of people who will only adopt it when they see other people doing it. But this can also be translated into your own personal dynamic. So at what point are you willing to take a risk and try this out because it's new to me? Or with the idea of this being part of a larger understanding, larger context, maybe it is something that you'll adopt more readily.
And that depicts research on the left end, and phase 2 and phase 3 studies, phase 4 studies. And then as you learn, because it's not just adopting for us as physicians, because it affects the patient.
Yes.
It's a new drug, for example.
Right.
So the curve is going to be similar, no doubt, but I was just thinking of all the things that apply to it.
Right, so this is the research, and at what point, how much evidence do you need before you'll adopt it?
Where the FDA approves.
Right. So all of those all those authorities have said this is a good thing. My colleagues are doing that. The hospital is saying we should do it. And then, of course, you'll always have people who it's more of the remediation phase, where they should have been doing this 15 years ago.
They're out the top there.
Right. So this adoption, this implementation can be supported by the environment in various ways. That a supportive environment that really highlights the value of adaptation, the risk of trying something new that might not work or that might have its own consequences, tolerant of errors, just good environments, and then going back again to what we said about feedback, providing data on whether your adoption of this new learning is really working. So you're not relying on just my gut feeling that I feel good about it, but it actually is producing the results that we want. That, again, is part of the environment that we can use to support that. So you go through that, you adopt it, and of course then there's a new gap. So you continue this cycle. Sometimes it's a continuous process, especially in the process of understanding than just factual learning. You go deeper and deeper into nuances, and if it's an area you are particularly interested in or part of your work, that gap identification and remediation and application just continues repeatedly over and over again. To wrap up, we wanted a couple of comments about the environment. We talked a little bit about how an effective environment can support this, but it can also hinder it. Learning environments, it's another hot topic. There's a lot of concern about it with LCME visits, with CLEAR visits for residency programs. What is the environment doing as a place for learning and practice? Is it creating stress, contributing to burnout and suicide, identified area of abuse? So How this relates to the master adaptive learning process is something that has not been examined to any great detail. But there are some things that you might speculate. One is that if you encourage people to follow this adaptive learning cycle, you are, in a sense, inoculating them from some of the impact of the environment, because you are enabling them, strengthening them, giving them the tools to learn in spite of the environment, because they are defining internally, in an adaptive way, their deficiencies, how they can respond to it. So unlike students who only listen to what happens in class, everything else is irrelevant, you are recognizing through this process that learning is something that happens all the time. I can influence it, I can control it, I can contribute to it, I can use the environment effectively to try to address these, even if it's not set up to be an ideal environment. But obviously what we hope is that we set up environments that are supportive, environments that encourage recognition of uncertainty, that encourage questioning, that make learning easy, provide the resources to go through this process, give feedback. All the things that we've talked about can be facilitated in a good environment. So this context is another part of the larger model that we need to pay more attention to, and we're working on as part of this group to develop it. So, right at time, I have time for a couple of questions if you want. Signaling something here. David.
Larry, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. I have several questions, but I think I'm going to settle on the one that has to do with the mindset.
Yeah.
That you talked about very early. How do we know? Are there ways to diagnose people's fixed versus growth mindset? I'm thinking about not only during the admissions process, but maybe later, because it seems to me that's a really key part of it.
Yes, there are methods for trying to distinguish these. And this is my dilemma, because I started off life as a personality psychologist, where individual differences were everything. You wanted to classify people into introverts and extroverts, fixed mindset, growth mindset. And when I was getting my PhD, they decided that there really was no such thing. And I had to find a different field to study. Because our behavior, we like to talk about as if, you're an extrovert, you're an introvert. But the reality is your behavior is determined as much by the environment, the situation, the people you're working with, lots of things besides whatever personal characteristics you might have. So, the short story is that you can identify these things in laboratory settings, and they may be tendencies that people have. How they actually translate into your behavior is something I'm not going to make strong claims about. I think it's a battery. It's kind of contributing to the energy in the whole system, but I'm not sure it's guiding the people into specific behaviors. So I'd be very leery about identifying the student as being a fixed mindset student, because it's not deterministic.
And the environment plays such a role.
Environment is everything.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things we're blessed with here. We have a pretty good environment. Well, in many cases,
Yes.
Yeah, one of the concerns I have is that med students start out being sort of socially isolated, because I'm not sure about the lectures. I've got that problem in Michigan that I think we got about 30% attendance rate at live lectures.
Well, 3 times ours.
Yeah. When you get to learning something, having reinforcement from colleagues is a critical part of incorporating that knowledge and validating. And so I see people isolate themselves already in med school. I wonder what you think the impact is on that.
Yeah, I think that goes back to this understanding. You can learn lots of factual stuff by listening to a recorded lecture. To really understand it, you have to You have to bounce it off other people. You have to
So
challenge it.
how do you put the genie back in the bottle?
Well, I'm not sure lecture was very good at that to begin with. I'm not sure a lecture was a very good format for promoting that to begin with. And even when everybody showed up, they were all focused on you.
I don't know, I mean, my own personal experience was that when you went away from the lecture, you sort of went over things with other people in a
Afterwards.
social context.
Yeah, afterwards. The
But
lecture itself.
if you're all doing this in the middle of the night, on an iPad, you're not going to be testing those ideas.
Right.
That's my take on that.
Although we find, and I suspect your students do too, that they have these kind of subversive cells of students that get together, and they do that because they recognize they're smart students. They know that studying together is effective, it is helpful. But we've kind of gone to a model where that was kind of a natural thing to happen because we're all leaving this room at the same time, and let's go get a cup of coffee and we can talk about this some more. They have to do it more intentionally. So I think we can have environments that are more or less supportive of that. But yeah, we're dealing with all of the same problems. We're finally getting faculty to recognize that maybe doing a live lecture to 12 students is a waste of their time because it's the same lecture they did last year.
Right.
So there's more of a tendency to just adopt the fact that everybody's going to be doing this at Starbucks on their own time, whatever schedule, and try to supplement that by having discussion sessions
Are
instead.
people finding that students are more socially isolated now? Because all these issues of feedback and stuff are sort of latecomers to the thing.
The environment certainly promotes that, and I'm really leery of these generational differences in kids nowadays. Because Socrates was saying that.
Sure.
So every environment is different, and things continue to change, and people adapt to it. So I'm not sure that to say that students are more isolated. There's probably different opportunities for them to interact, and the lecture isn't one of them anymore. But we're building, I'm not sure about facilities, but we're talking about a new education tower that's going to be all about small group rooms. So we're recognizing and trying to promote in the environment the opportunities for students to get together. And whereas I was at the International Conference on Residency Education, and there was, I don't understand it myself, but all this talk about social media and WhatsApp as an app for students to message each other, and that this was taking place all the time. And they were talking about cases, never seeing each other, but it was all this virtual communication. You're adapting to it somehow. So
Working together in that way.
You mentioned that, aren't the students self-selecting? Those
entirely.
That 10% or 30% who come to lecture actually want that interaction.
Yes.
And I don't agree that it's a waste of a faculty member's time to be there. I've gotten over the fact that only 10 or 20% are there, because those who come are interacting.
I think we need to change the expectation that, okay, I'm doing we shouldn't even call it a lecture anymore. I'm doing a tutorial or something like this, but it's going to take place here. And maybe we don't have it in this big empty lecture hall. So I think that part of what we wrestle with is that fact, we still have the expectation, I'm going to have 170 students hanging on my every word, which they never had anyway. But it does
Yeah, they're asleep.
Yeah, right. And the rest are shopping.
Right.
Well, see, we're not watching you on an iPad. We're here because we think this is important, right?
Right.
And we think that the interaction actually has value too. So that's what we're trying to bring to the.
And that's a really important point that we discussed last month too, is it's not about the lecture or the strategy, it's how you implement the strategy.
Right.
So being interactive, doing things to engage your audience, I think is really important.
Right.
I think Dr. Garvin has talked a lot about environment, so the way in which we create the environment, the fixed versus the growth mindset is something, at least superficially we can see, like when my daughter says, Mom, I'm horrible at math, so you're just going to have to accept that grade. No, you're not there yet. So it's working on it. It's maybe putting a little bit more energy into that. And I know that we see that a lot with our medical students. What I see with you all from my perspective is that you all are outstanding, at least in teaching, as master adaptive learners. You are identifying the gaps, saying, I don't know all there is to know about teaching. So, and I know that all of you in this room are already really great teachers. So you've identified a gap. You are coming here to fulfill the gap. You're identifying the resources. Now you need to go out and try to practice and try to implement those and see how it goes. And then if it doesn't work, switch something else up. That's why what we try to provide through Teach. And I hope that it helps in a lot of ways. I hope to see you all back at 5 o'clock over at the Simulation Center, and please encourage your colleagues to come at noon. So thank you, Dr. Gruffin.